right before the intro, you mentioned about how Batman's superpower is really sacrifice. And I kind of love that because when we think about him sort of in context of his life, like he's had some terrible things happen to him, but he's also fabulously wealthy. So he could really pretty much do anything he wanted, right? If he wanted to be lying on a beach somewhere, he could. Like he has that choice available to him. Right, so it's not just the individual, like physical sacrifice of training and going out in the dark and fighting bad guys and all that, but it's also the choices of how he chooses to spend his time, which goes back to what we talked about in the last episode of having the something bigger than yourself to care about. And so already we see at the beginning of this movie, he's got that, right? He's got the willingness to self-sacrifice, and he's got the I care about something bigger than myself. I need to fix this city. I need to make things better. And the Riddler sort of has that and sort of doesn't, right? He wants revenge, right? He wants revenge for the bad things. He's consumed by vengeance. And I feel like the Bruce Wayne Batman character he's using this vengeance tagline as like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, but he hasn't really settled into it, right? He's not super happy with it, and he's clear that it's just sort of stemming a rising tide, and he's just not getting it done.
Yeah, you're right that it's almost like he hasn't yet understood who Batman is, like what creates Batman's character, what makes Batman the symbol that, because it's the symbol that constitutes fear, right? Not the symbol that constitutes hope. But we know from Batman lore that that's the bat symbol is about hope, not fear. So I love that. And how does he bring hope to people? He brings hope by continuously making the difficult decisions. This is something that the Riddler never figures out at any point. To him, he is wronged. He goes through trauma at a younger age. We hear about it with the situation where he looks up to Thomas Wayne and he thinks he's going to help solve the problem, and then finds out that Thomas Wayne theoretically had his dad murdered or whatever happened there. And it becomes his villain origin story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the recognition when you're wronged, and that, like we talked about in the last episode, the want of the ego to be self-righteous and to be vindicated in that, to have everything made right for you. Batman has everything, has a lot of unfair things happen to him, and he never lets it become a chip on his shoulder, really. Instead, he lets it become the impetus for him to sacrifice for others. And so I love that we see him learn that lesson in this movie in a way that we don't in almost any of the other Batman movies. But the cool part, as we talked about, is how that contrasts with the Riddler, who's dealing with a lot of the same origin story that Batman's dealing with as an orphan, as the struggling to find his place, needs to have a mentor, blah, blah, blah. But he falls flat. So, Brian, let's talk about the mountaintop and why the Riddler does not succeed where Batman does.
Right. So our mountaintop scene, working our way up to this, is for the most of this movie, the Riddler is sort of a shadowy figure, and the only thing we see from him is, cryptic messages, handwritten greeting cards with scribbles on them, and kind of grainy off-angle videos of him in a mask breathing really heavily and saying kind of crazy things and threatening the elite of the with the corrupt elite with vengeance and all that. So we don't really interact with him until quite deep into the movie, after he has killed Falcone or had Falcone killed, they find him upstairs. They chase him upstairs to his apartment, and then he's gone. He's escaped, but he hasn't gone very far. He's just sitting at a cafe drinking a cup of coffee, and he's just ordered a cup of pumpkin pie. so they put him in prison. They take him to Arkham Asylum because he's clearly insane, and he asks to see Batman. And so Batman shows up in Batman garb, not masked or whatever, and to interrogate him and to try to figure out what is it he's trying to accomplish. And he kind of has this suspicion that the plan isn't over yet, that like Falcone wasn't the last domino to fall. And so we have some fun bait and switch in that meeting where Batman thinks that maybe he's being unmasked or not. But what happens is we find out the Riddler's like, oh, we should be friends. Like we're the same. We're both vigilantes beating up on the people that are, that have hurt us and that are screwing up this city. And so like, of course, you saw my stuff, and I've been sending you all these love letters, and like, you know, Bruce has been mistrustful this whole time. Like, why is he targeting me? Why is he involved in this? Like, he's kind of a fanboy. Like, he's just like, oh, you're great. Like, I'm really smart and you're really strong, and we're both fighting the same fights, and we're just going to be a team. And we did a great job. We killed that mob boss, and now we can get the rest of them. Like, this is totally not the conversation that Batman thinks is about to have. And he misunderstands it in this moment as like, oh, well, this guy's just crazy. Like, this guy's like, he's clearly he's so hurt, he's so alone, he's so confused, he's so hateful that he's just like, he's taking me for something that I'm not, and like, he's just crazy. And Batman's very upset about this whole interaction, and about, and the fact that he's been portrayed in this light by this insane, serial killer. And then it's revealed that there's more pieces to the plot, and the Riddler's really disappointed that he didn't understand the whole, he didn't detect all the clues. And then Riddler's really upset. He breaks down into like, this is not how this meeting was supposed to go. I've been in those meetings. This is not how this was supposed to go. I've been in those meetings. Like, that's, you don't want to have a performance review that goes that way. But Batman completely rejects this whole angle in this meeting. And it's not until later in the movie where we get the second half of the mountaintop. Right at the very end, on the platform, when Batman has defeated all the vigilantes, and then Selina Kyle saved him, and then he saved her back and beaten up on the vigilante, and they unmask this vigilante and they ask him who he is. And he gives Batman's catchphrase back. He's like, oh, I'm vengeance. And it's not until that moment, like 2 hours and 48 minutes into this movie, right, that Bruce actually figures out what's going on. Right. That he actually figures out that he is a leader, and he has, by extension, inspired the Riddler, who has inspired these murderous psychopaths, to be just like him. And he realizes, like, in that moment, like, in my head, I'm different than the Riddler because I have friends and I love people and I have the ability to try to do better in the world. But outside, nobody can tell the difference.
That's really good. And as leaders, the image that we're putting up is not always the image that we have in our head. And there's times when that's easier and harder to see. I was talking to a guy recently who has a young child, and he was explaining that situation himself. He's like, well, in my head, it seems like it goes like this, but then I can tell, like, with my young child, they kind of like parrot it back. And I'm like, was I really like that? Like, because to me, everything seems fine. And yet to other people, I might seem a little bit overly passionate. I might seem angrier than I am, whatever. And in this situation, it all comes back to, which we talk about often, like, what is your mission? Because Batman doesn't really have a mission. And when your mission is strictly to be against something, you're like, well, this is tyranny. It's like, okay, that's not a bad thing to be against it, but then you also have to find something that you're going to stand for.
And the way you express what that is really important. People are going to follow you if you're not articulating your goals. If you're hiding in the shadows and just showing up and beating up people, like, they're going to sort of assume that that's what you're around for, right? Like, so if you're a leader and, if somebody observes you in a meeting with somebody else and you're just flaming them, right? It might be because you're super passionate about your, product quality or your custom experience, or, the trouble that could have happened if somebody screwed up. Like, it could be that you were really trying to protect the company. It could be you're really trying to protect that person from making a terrible mistake. But somebody casually observing you, if you didn't say that out loud, if they just observed you flaming somebody for doing something you disagreed with, then the lesson they're going to take is like, oh, that's the leader's way to behave in this organization. Like, that's the thing that I should model myself after. And so Bruce doesn't learn that lesson for a bunch of this movie, even though in his head and in small private moments, he's forming relationships and he's trying to make his immediate environment better. His public persona as a leader is just against things. It's just fixing problems by very severe methods. And that doesn't inspire anybody to do anything other than give them permission to do the same thing with problems they perceive.
I'm kind of second guessing here now. Is the problem exclusively that he is against things and not for something? I mean, obviously that's a problem here. or at least a solution would be to be for something. But I think you can also be really for a mission, but if you're not for values and for a purpose, even that can be an issue because that's an easier work example. Yeah, there are some people that you work with that are just against everything, especially change, right? They're going to be like out of pocket. Yeah, I don't think we should do that because that's new and that's a risk. Of course, I don't want to poo poo those people right now. They got enough to deal with. But what about the people, and we may or may not have been these people in our lives, who are just so mission oriented that to everybody else who's watching, it's like, well, I guess it's just the mission at all costs. And they throw aside values. And to you, if you're that person, you might think like, oh, well, the end justifies the means. Like the mission that we're trying to accomplish is a good one. It's a worthwhile mission to accomplish. But the problem is you're giving everybody else permission to live under the philosophy the end justifies the means.
And I think that feeds back into our last episode, right? The Falcone, the trap of the ends justifying the means, the trap of doing things at all costs to get what you want, is that you end up, you end up locked into that cycle of behavior. And yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. Is that you kind of have to have both, right? You have to have a purpose that is bigger than I'm fixing this problem. You have to have limits on your behavior so that the way that you interact with people around you, even in the case of a problem, isn't has some guardrails on it, like isn't inherently toxic. And you have to be saying these things out loud, right? If you just let people infer why you're doing things because all they do is observe your actions and observe when you're really upset or observe when you're doing something really dramatic, like they might be excited that you're fighting the fires, but they might not understand like what your what your bigger goal is unless you say it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a thing that the Riddler never figures out, right? He never connects with anybody. He expresses his being against things, and he looks for people that are equally angry. But he keeps his mask on the whole time. Like he doesn't build any friendships. He's got like this online community of people that helped him figure out how to plug a detonator into C4, and they all want to put on masks and come help him shoot people. Like those aren't really long sustainable relationships. Those are just very
Those are
reactive, very negative.
transactional. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's just what can you.
It's cathartic, but it's not, it's not building anything. Right. And so, yeah, we don't see Batman build anything, except for his own toys until the very end of this movie. And by a complete coincidence, we don't see anybody following him or trusting him until the very end of this movie. Right. He does individual interactions pretty well, which the Riddler never does, but he doesn't do the big public gestures. He's self-sacrificing, but he's never seen to self-sacrifice until the end. And that's what this movie portrays, of course, big glossy superhero movie, right? But that sense that he has to internalize not just fighting against things, but also looking for opportunities to help and looking for opportunities to be an example of somebody who is self-sacrificing and helping, which very few other characters in the movie do.